The light that warmed his saloon came from the very travelers who drank there. In 1874, deep in the heart of Nevada, a tavern keeper named Malachi did something no one would dare imagine. He made candles not from wax but from the dead. The very light that warmed his saloon came from the bodies of the travelers who drank there. These eerie flames burned longer than any candle should, but they weren't just lighting the room, they were trapping souls. This isn't a tale of a simple innkeeper, but a man who carved his own fate by making a deadly bargain. What happens when the price of survival is the lives of the very souls who seek refuge in your door? Malachi's boots crunched against the dry Nevada earth as he stepped off the stagecoach, eyes squinting into the harsh sun. He was a man who had worn many names, but none of them were important anymore. Today, he was just Malachi, the man who had come to start over. This small, remote town was as good a place as any for a man like him to hide. He had left his past behind in a haze of dust and blood, and now all he wanted was peace. The saloon sat at the edge of town, weathered and worn, its windows covered in dirt and grime, a relic of a time long past. The building was a far cry from the grand establishments he had once frequented, but it would do. He had enough money to keep it running for a while, enough to ensure he could keep his head down and stay out of trouble. No one would know who he was, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. He pushed open the heavy door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the dimly lit room. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer and smoke. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the low murmur of conversation fell silent as the few patrons turned to size him up. He tipped his hat back and surveyed the room, old men nursing their drinks, a poker game in the corner, and a lonely fire burning in the hearth. Nothing too unusual, nothing that would raise suspicion. The bartender, a grizzled man with a face like leather, looked him up and down before nodding. "What'll it be, stranger?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. "He'll take whatever you've got," Malachi replied, his voice low and steady. "I'm here for the long haul." The bartender poured him a drink without question, sliding it across the bar. Malachi took a sip, the alcohol burning its way down his throat, and let out a quiet sigh. This place wasn't much, but it was his now. As the evening wore on, the tavern began to fill. A few more travelers stopped by, some staying for a drink, others for a night's rest. Malachi watched them all with a quiet curiosity. Each one of them had a story, a history they were running from or hiding, just like him. He could see it in their eyes, the same darkness, the same desperation that had once consumed him. For now, though, he didn't need to know their stories. He just needed to keep his head low and keep the saloon running smoothly. But there was something about the fire in the corner. It burned too brightly, too steadily. It gave off more heat than any normal fire should. It seemed unnatural. Malachi dismissed it at first, attributing it to the strange architecture of the saloon or perhaps the age of the wood. But the warmth was undeniable. It felt almost alive. By midnight, the last of the patrons had drifted off, leaving Malachi alone in the flickering glow of the fire. He leaned against the bar, his eyes drifting to the hearth once again. The flames danced with an almost hypnotic rhythm, casting shadows that seemed to shift with the flicker of each ember. It was as if the fire had a life of its own, a pulse that matched his own heartbeat. He frowned. The sensation unsettled him. The wind howled outside, sending a chill through the cracks in the walls. The tavern creaked in protest, and for a moment, Malachi thought he heard something faint. A whisper? No, it was impossible. He was alone. Still, the whisper seemed to grow louder, coming from the direction of the fire. He stood up straight, his hand instinctively going to the worn handle of the gun at his hip. His nerves were on edge, and his instinct screamed at him that something was wrong. The fire crackled again, the flames twisting and turning in a way that was far too deliberate. Without thinking, Malachi reached for the poker, pushing it into the flames to stir the embers. The moment the metal touched the fire, the temperature shot up, far beyond what it should have. "Bin." Malachi recoiled, his face flushing with sudden heat. Then, as he pulled back, he saw it, something in the fire shape, a figure, flickering in the light. At first, it was a vague outline, but as the flames grew stronger, it took on more substance. A man he didn't recognize, but whose face seemed hauntingly familiar. The figure reached out, its hand rising out of the fire like it was being pulled from another world. Malachi stumbled back, knocking over his stool as he scrambled for the door. The figure in the fire was real. The air around him seemed to shift, growing thick and heavy, and the faint smell of decay filled his nose. His pulse raced as he fumbled with the doorknob, but before he could escape, the flame shifted again, and the shape vanished. He stood in the doorway, his hand still gripping the knob, and stared into the hearth. The fire burned as normal now, calm and steady, too steady. He could still feel the heat against his skin, as if the flames were calling to him. Malachi had heard stories, ghost stories, tales of the dead returning, of restless souls seeking vengeance. But this was something else. His heart pounded in his chest, and the cold sweat on his brow told him he was in far deeper than he had realized. This wasn't just a tavern. It wasn't just a place to drink and forget. This was something far more sinister. The fire the light was not normal. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to focus. There was a job to do. The fire had been nothing more than a trick of the mind, nothing more than the heat from the hearth. He could convince himself of that. He had to. Malachi turned back to the bar and reached for the bottle of whiskey, trying to steady his nerves. But when he looked into the bottle's reflection, there was something in it. A shape, a shadow, his own face, but not quite. It was distorted, as though something was inside him. His throat went dry. The bottle shattered as his hand trembled, sending glass shards to the floor with a sharp crack. In the fragments, he saw it again, a face, clearer this time. A face he recognized, the man from the fire, the man who had stepped from the flames. It wasn't a trick of the light. The fire wasn't an illusion, it was a warning. He could feel the weight of the darkness bearing down on him. He wasn't here just to run from his past. He was here because something had called him, and that something, whatever it was waiting for him to light the next candle. Malachi didn't understand it yet, but this was only the beginning. The dead were already here, and they had come for him. The days blurred together for Malachi. He spent his time cleaning the saloon, lighting the strange candles, and serving drinks to the few weary travelers who passed through. His eyes always drifted back to the fire. It still burned too brightly, casting an almost unnatural glow over the room. The whispers in his mind never stopped, though he tried to convince himself it was just the stress of the last few days. The saloon had a strange aura to it. Every evening, the same faces would return, as if they were drawn by some invisible force. They came, they drank, and they left. But something about them was off. The more Malachi observed them, the more he felt a deep sense of unease settle in his chest. These weren't normal travelers. They weren't just passing through. They were like him, running from something or perhaps to something. One evening, a man entered the saloon. He was tall, with a gaunt face and dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through Malachi. He was dressed in a worn coat, a traveler's hat pulled low over his brow, hiding most of his features. Malachi had seen men like him before, people whose eyes carried the weight of years spent on the road, people who had seen things they shouldn't have. But there was something in the man's eyes that made Malachi's skin crawl. The man took a seat at the far end of the bar, his gaze locked on Malachi's every move. He didn't speak for a long time, merely staring into his glass. But then, when Malachi walked past him to refill a drink, the man's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "You don't remember me, do you?" Malachi stopped dead in his tracks, his blood running cold. The man hadn't raised his voice, but there was an intensity in his words that sent a shiver down Malachi's spine. The way he spoke, so calm, so certain, it was as if he knew something Malachi didn't. "What are you talking about?" Malachi forced out, his voice tight. He turned, trying to mask the growing unease that threatened to show on his face. The man's eyes narrowed, studying him with an almost predatory gaze. "I know you," he said slowly, as if savoring the words. "I know exactly who you are." Malachi's mind raced, the fog of alcohol and fatigue clearing in an instant. He didn't recognize this man, didn't remember him from anywhere. But something in the back of his mind still read a name, a face, buried beneath years of guilt and buried secrets. He had to focus. He couldn't let it get to him. He forced a smile, trying to hide his growing panic. "You must be mistaken, friend. I don't know you." The man laughed softly, the sound low and unsettling. "You don't remember, but I remember you. You can't hide from your past, Malachi. It's always with you, just like the dead." The words hit Malachi like a slap. His heart skipped a beat. His pulse raced, his throat tight with the knowledge that something far darker than he had imagined was coming for him. He swallowed, trying to steady himself. "You don't know what you're talking about," Malachi muttered, his voice shaking despite his efforts to stay calm. The man leaned in, his face inches from Malachi's. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know all about the bodies you've buried and the souls you've taken. You think you've gotten away with it? You think you can run from what you've done? You can't. You never will." Malachi's stomach twisted into knots. His hands were clammy, his breath coming in shallow. Bursts. He tried to back away, but the man's gaze held him in place, as if some invisible force was keeping him rooted to the spot. He could feel the weight of the words, the accusation hanging between them like a dark cloud. The man straightened up, his smile cold and cruel. "The dead don't forget, and neither should you. But don't worry, you'll remember soon enough." With that, the man stood up and walked out of the saloon, leaving Malachi standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was spinning, the room seeming to close in around him. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Who was that man? How did he know? And why did it feel like a reckoning was finally here? Malachi turned to the fire, the flickering light casting grotesque shadows across the room. He watched as the flames danced, remembering the strange figure he had seen in the fire before. The flames seemed to grow brighter, their light more intense. The whispers in his head grew louder, clearer. Malachi, he spun around, heart racing. No one was there. The saloon was empty, save for the fire and the shadows. But the voice, it had been real. He had heard it again unmistakably. It was coming from the fire. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't imagining things. The spirits were here, and they were reaching out to him. He could feel their cold fingers brushing against his mind, pulling him into the darkness. His sins were catching up with him, and there was nowhere to hide. Malachi staggered toward the hearth, his hand trembling as he reached for the poker. He needed to do something, anything, to make it stop. He had to rid himself of this feeling, this suffocating fear that had gripped him ever since he arrived. The poker burned his hand as he shoved it into the fire, and in the instant the metal touched the flames, the room seemed to explode with heat. He recoiled, his heart racing in his chest, but as he looked down, something was different. The flame had changed. It flickered, shifting in unnatural ways, swirling around the poker like it was alive. And then, from within the flames, the shape appeared again, the same figure he had seen before, stepping from the fire as though it were some kind of portal. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. A man, his face burned and disfigured, his eyes empty sockets staring back at Malachi. "You remember me now, don't you?" the figure whispered, its voice an echo of the man from the saloon. Malachi stumbled back, gasping for breath, his knees weak. The figure in the fire stretched out its hand, as if beckoning him closer. The flames reached higher, their hunger growing. Malachi's chest tightened, his mind spinning. He could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him, crushing him with the guilt of the lives he had taken. And then, with the final, horrifying realization, Malachi understood. The dead weren't just haunting him. They were waiting for him. They were calling him back into the flames. But this was just the beginning of his nightmare. The dead were not done with him yet. They were growing restless, and their vengeance would be far worse than he could ever imagine. The night was oppressive, thick with the weight of secrets that Malachi couldn't outrun. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. But this time, the shadows didn't seem to be just shadows. They moved with a purpose, like they were alive, like they were watching him. Malachi paced the length of the saloon, unable to sit still. The figure in the fire, the figure from his past, was seared into his mind. It had looked like a man he had once killed, someone whose death was buried in the dark corners of his memory. But it wasn't just the figure, it was the voice, the way it echoed in his ears, the way it seemed to know him. It wasn't just his guilt that was consuming him now. Something had changed. The fire was different. It was no longer just a simple flame warming the saloon. It was a portal, a living, breathing thing that fed on his past, on the souls he had taken. And Malachi knew that he had made a terrible mistake. The idea came to him slowly, like a seed taking root. The candles he had been making for the saloon, those strange, unnaturally long-burning flames were not normal. They weren't just candles. They were conduits for the spirits, the very souls he had stolen, the souls trapped in the flames. Malachi had been lighting those candles without understanding their true power, their true cost. He had thought they were just a way to light the room, to keep the darkness at bay. But the darkness was inside him, inside the saloon, growing stronger with each flicker of the flame. It wasn't just the fire that was alive, it was the souls inside it, and they were angry, hungry. He glanced at the table in the corner where a half-burned candle sat. It was one of his creations, made from the remains of an old traveler who had wandered too close to the tavern's doors. He had done what he always did, used the bodies of the dead to make his candles, offering the warmth of their remains to those who passed through the doors of the saloon. But now, as he stared at the flickering flame, it didn't feel like a simple candle. It felt wrong. The flame wavered, growing taller, casting a brighter, more intense light. Malachi's heart raced. The fire was calling to him, pulling at him like a magnet, a force he couldn't resist. He felt the heat growing, radiating out from the candles, suffocating him. The air in the saloon felt thick, like it was closing in, like the very walls were shifting. He reached for the candle, his hand trembling. The flame burned hotter than he could have ever imagined. The air around him seemed to ripple with energy, and he gasped, feeling the weight of something pressing down on him. And then it happened. The flame flared, suddenly exploding out of the candle. Malachi stumbled backward, his hands singed by the heat. He could hear the whispers. Again, louder now, more frantic. The spirits trapped inside the flames were screaming, their voices mingling with the crackling fire. He felt a pull, a tug in his chest. The flame had grown so intense that it was no longer just a light, it was a force that seemed to want to drag him into it. The flickering flame beckoned him forward, but Malachi resisted, his feet rooted to the ground, heart pounding in his chest. The whispers grew louder, sharper. "You can't hide," they said. "You can't escape." Malachi closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise, trying to shake the feeling that the saloon itself was closing in on him. But when he opened his eyes, the fire had changed. It was no longer just a flame, it was a shape, a figure, a face he knew. The face in the fire was his own. Malachi's breath caught in his throat as he saw his own reflection warped, twisted, like a grotesque mirror image. But it wasn't just his face. There was something behind it, something lurking in the shadows of the flame, something dark, something evil. He staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't just a trick of the fire. The flames were alive, and they were showing him something. They were showing him the truth. The flames didn't just represent the souls of the dead, they represented his own soul, twisted by the crimes he had committed. Each time he lit a candle, he had been feeding his own sins, feeding the darkness inside him. The spirits had been calling to him because they weren't just victims, they were a part of him. They were his conscience, his guilt, his punishment. Malachi's legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees in front of the fire. He didn't know how much time had passed. His mind was reeling, his thoughts in chaos. The fire was no longer just a thing. It was a living, breathing part of him, and he couldn't escape it. The saloon had been built on death, the death of those he had wronged. The dead were not just trapped in the flames, they were bound to him. They had always been a part of him, waiting for the moment when he would finally realize the truth that he couldn't escape. But it wasn't just the fire that was burning, it was him. The flames flickered again, the figure in the fire shifting, taking shape. The face twisted, its eyes black, hollow, empty. But the whispering continued, growing louder and louder. "You've taken everything from us." Malachi clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the spirits pressing in on him. They were closing in. They were coming for him. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't outrun them. With a final, agonizing scream, the figure in the fire reached out, its hand extending toward Malachi. He felt his soul being pulled, being dragged into the flame. He fought, thrashing against the invisible force, but it was no use. The dead had come for him, and they were taking him with them. The fire hadn't just consumed the candle, it had consumed him. And in the ashes of his past, Malachi would discover the horrifying price he would have to pay to escape the flames. Malachi awoke to darkness. The fire was out, the saloon eerily quiet, but the lingering heat in the air told him that something had happened, something had changed. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim, cold light that trickled in through the cracked windows. The silence around him felt unnatural, suffocating. He hadn't even realized when he had fallen asleep, but now, as he slowly sat up, the weight of what had happened last night crashed back into him. The flames, the face in the fire, his own face. The realization was still too much to process. His heart was still racing from the terror, the inexplicable pull he felt toward the flames as if they had reached into his very soul. The fire had shown him something worse than he could have imagined. It had shown him the truth, his sins, his guilt, the dead. They were all bound to him. All these years Malachi had run, hiding from his past, thinking that the darkness he carried could be buried and forgotten. But the truth was, the darkness had followed him. It had always been inside him, feeding on the souls he had taken, growing stronger with every candle he lit. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how deeply entangled the saloon, the fire, and the spirits were with his own twisted past. It wasn't just the candlestove's cursed flames that burned with the souls of the dead. It was the entire saloon. It had been built on death, built on the blood of the innocent. Malachi stumbled to his feet, his body heavy, his mind fogged with the weight of the horror he had witnessed. His fingers twitched, a strange compulsion creeping through him as he reached toward the back of the bar where his latest batch of candles sat. They were all made from the bodies of travelers who had passed through, the saloon strangers who had been drawn to his tavern without knowing the cost. The candles flickered softly in the dim light, their flames dancing like whispers in the dark. Malachi took one in his hands, the warm wax cool against his fingers. The flame on the wick burned steady, unyielding, as though it had its own will. His eyes narrowed. He had to understand what was happening, why these candles seemed to call to him. He had tried to convince himself it was nothing, that it was just a saloon, just a simple place to drink. But the fire had shown him the truth. These candles weren't just lighting the room, they were alive, feeding off the souls of the dead. And the more candles he lit, the more the spirits would come, the more they would demand from him. A chill ran down his spine and a deep, sickening feeling twisted his gut. He couldn't stop. He could unmake the candles, couldn't undo the damage he had already done. Every time he burned one, the spirits grew stronger. And if he didn't act soon, the souls would escape and they would take him with them. As if on cue, the whispers began again, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. The voices filled the room, echoing in his mind, pushing into his ears like a rush of water. They weren't speaking in words. It was more like a constant hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to vibrate with his very soul. He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to block them out, but the whispers only grew louder. The flames in the candles flickered and twisted like something alive, feeding on his terror, on his guilt. Malachi. The voices were clearer now, distinct, like they were coming from inside him. His chest tightened. The dead were speaking directly to him. "Why are you hiding? Why are you running?" The voice was different now, a familiar one, a voice he thought he had forgotten. He froze. It was the voice of the manth one who had come to him last night, the one who had accused him of his past sins. How did he know? You can never escape your sins. The room spun, and for a moment the walls seemed to shift, as if reality itself was warping around him. Malachi staggered back, gripping the bar to steady himself. The candles burned brighter now, filling the room with their sickly glow, their flames stretching out toward him like claws. Suddenly, the saloon door creaked open. Malachi's heart leapt in his chest as he whipped his head toward the sound. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale light of the desert. It was him, the man from the fire. The man whose face had haunted his nightmares, whose voice had echoed in his ears. The man Malachi had killed so many years ago. No, Malachi's voice cracked as he took a step back. "This isn't real," the man didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air grew thick with a strange pressure, like the very atmosphere was closing in on him. Malachi's breath quickened, panic bubbling inside him. His past had found him, and it wasn't letting him go. "Your sins have found you, Malachi," the man said, his voice cold and steady. "And now the dead are coming for you." Malachi looked at the candles. The flames were growing, expanding, stretching across the room like they wanted to engulf him. He could hear the whispers in the fire, louder now, like a chant, a ritual. The flames seemed to reach for the shadows, calling something forth from the darkness. The man stepped forward, and Malachi felt his legs give out beneath him. He dropped to his knees, his eyes fixed on the man's face. "No," he gasped. "Please, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." The man's voice was like ice. "You knew what you were doing. You knew the price of every life you took." The fire roared, the shadows in the room seemed to writhe, and for a brief moment, the flames distorted. Malachi saw something in the fire, someone, a woman. Her face was burned and twisted, but there was no mistaking her. It was another one of his victims. The woman's eyes locked with Malachi's. Her lips parted, her voice an eerie, hollow echo. "You'll never escape." Malachi's heart slammed against his chest, the walls closing in as the voices of the dead filled the room, wrapping around him like chains. His mind spun, the guilt threatening to drown him. There was no escape, no way out. The man from his past stepped closer. The flames flickered, growing higher, blinding him. "You can try to fight it," the man said softly, "but you will never be free." Malachi's body trembled as he reached toward the fire, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The flames were calling to him. They would burn him. They would consume him. The candles around the room grew hotter, their flames now wild and uncontrollable, the room suffocating with the heat. Malachi could feel the very walls pressing in on him. The dead were coming for him. His past was catching up with him. He didn't know if he could stop it. He didn't know if he could survive the inferno he had started. But as the fire burned brighter, Malachi realized that this was only the beginning of his torment. The dead weren't just after him, they were after his soul. And the price of redemption was far worse than he could ever have imagined. The days blurred together, each one feeling like a waking nightmare. Malachi moved through the saloon like a ghost, his every action mechanical, disconnected from the reality around him. The weight of the dead pressed on his shoulders, their whispers like an endless chorus in his ears. The flames from the candles never seemed to go out, always flickering, always burning, always watching. The saloon as refuge, his new life was becoming a tomb. and he was the one who had buried himself inside it. The patrons who came to drink now seemed different. They moved with an eerie stillness, their eyes glazed and distant, their smiles twisted. The very air in the tavern felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of spirits that lingered in the flames, waiting for something. The warmth from the fire no longer comforted them. It consumed them. The more people who entered, the more the spirits were fed, growing stronger with each passing day. Malachi had made a deal with darkness, and now that darkness was spreading, crawling into every corner of the saloon. One evening, as the last of the regulars stumbled out into the night, Malachi found himself standing before the hearth again, mesmerized by the flames. He had tried to destroy the candles, but every time he thought he had put them out, they reignited, their flames burning hotter, brighter, feeding on his guilt, his fear, his every sin. The fire wasn't just a light, it was a reflection of him, of what he had become. The door opened with a creak, and a man stepped inside. Malachi barely looked up, his thoughts consumed by the flames, but the man's voice broke through the haze in his mind. "Is it always this cold in here?" the man asked, his voice tinged with an odd mixture of curiosity and disdain. Malachi raised his eyes slowly, studying the newcomer. The man was young, no older than 20, with wild eyes that seemed out of place in the quiet, dimly lit saloon. His clothes were simple, weather-worn, but what caught Malachi's attention was the man's face. He looked familiar, though Malachi couldn't place him. There was something unsettling about him, something that made Malachi's skin crawl. "I've never been bothered by it," Malachi muttered, his voice distant. The man didn't sit down, but he didn't leave either. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto Malachi. "You don't look well," the man remarked, his tone casual but sharp. "You're haunted by something, aren't you? Something you can't escape." Malachi froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This man, he knew. Somehow, he knew. The words cut through him, revealing his deepest fear, the truth that had always lurked at the edges of his mind. He had spent years trying to outrun it, but now it was closing in on him. The man was right. He was being haunted, not just by the ghosts of the dead, but by the ghosts of his past lives he had taken, the people he had betrayed. The young man's eyes flickered toward the hearth, and Malachi followed his gaze. The fire seemed to respond, shifting and crackling, as if acknowledging the newcomer. And for a split second, Malachi saw Eton's image, a vision in the flames, a face he had not seen in years. It was a woman's face, burned and disfigured, her eyes wide with terror. The first one, the first person he had killed, the one whose body he had used to make his first candle. Malachi's breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to tilt, the flames flickering wildly as the figure in the fire became clearer, more vivid. Her face twisted with pain, with anger. Her voice screamed inside his mind, "You can't escape." Malachi lurched back, his hands scrambling for something to hold on to, anything to steady himself. He felt his chest tighten, his heart racing. He couldn't breathe. But the young man stood there, watching him with an expression that was almost amused. "What's the matter, Malachi?" the man asked softly. "You're seeing her again, aren't you? She's always there, waiting." Malachi swallowed hard, his mind reeling. He had thought it was over. He had thought he could keep running, keep hiding. But this man, this stranger, had walked in and ripped the mask off his carefully constructed life. The woman, the first victim, the first soul he had condemned, wasn't just haunting him. She was still with him. "She's not real," Malachi whispered, more to himself than to the man. "Oh, but she is," the stranger replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The dead never leave. They wait, and they feed." Malachi's stomach churned. The man's words felt like poison in his ears. "You've been feeding them, haven't you?" the man continued, "feeding the fire, feeding the darkness, but now it's feeding on you." Malachi's hand clenched around the edge of the bar. The young man was right. The flamest candle had always been feeding on him. The dead, the spirits, they were growing stronger with every soul he took, with every life he used to fuel his cursed fire. And now they were coming for him. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Malachi breathed, his voice breaking. I didn't know." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. You knew what you were doing, you always have. The price for comfort is never free. You've taken so much, Malachi, and now you'll pay." Suddenly the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped and the flames in the hearth flickered violently, casting long dancing shadows across the walls. The figure of the woman appeared again, her face twisted in agony, her eyes locked onto Malachi. Her mouth moved, but no sound came from her, just the deafening silence of 1,000 souls screaming for vengeance. Malachi stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him. He reached out, but his hand only brushed against the bar before he crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. The flames had consumed him. The fire had taken everything. "You're not leaving," the stranger whispered, stepping closer, his voice dripping with venom. "Not until you face what you've done." The room felt suffocating now, as if the walls were closing in. Malachi could feel the weight of the souls pressing down on him, their voices rising to a fever pitch. The fire, the flames, they had turned into something worse, as something alive, something that wanted him. And then, for the first time since he had stepped foot in the saloon, Malachi realized the truth. He wasn't just running from the dead. He was running from himself. The stranger's figure began to fade, the flames swallowing him whole. "You'll never escape," the man's voice echoed one last time, before the shadows of the fire consumed him. Malachi was alone, but not truly. The dead were still there, waiting. The fire was still burning, and now there was no way out. But Malachi wasn't done yet. He had been given a choice to feed or to burn, and the flames, hungry and insatiable, weren't done with him, not yet. The following days were a blur. Malachi had tried to keep the saloon running, to go about his business as though nothing had changed, but it was impossible. The whispers never stopped. The flames never stopped burning, and no matter what he did, he couldn't escape the truth. The spirits had come for him, and they were never going to leave. The walls of the saloon seemed to close in on him every time he stepped inside. He could feel their presence, the cold touch of the dead on the back of his neck. The candles flickered with a life of their own, and the fire in the hearth burned so bright that it felt as if the room itself was trying to swallow him whole. But no matter how hard he tried, Malachi couldn't destroy the fire. He couldn't stop the flames from consuming everything in their path. It was late in the evening when it happened. The saloon door creaked open, and Malachi looked up, expecting another weary traveler, or perhaps another regular would, had too much to drink. But this time, it wasn't just any man who walked through the door. It was him, the same stranger who had entered the tavern weeks ago, the man whose face Malachi had never been able to forget. The man whose presence seemed to haunt the very air around him. He stood there in the doorway, his eyes cold and unwavering, as though he had never left. Malachi's heart skipped a beat. He had thought the man was gone for good, that the encounter had been some kind of twisted dream. But here he was, back again, like a shadow from Malachi's past that refused to fade. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto Malachi's with a knowing intensity. "You didn't think you could get away, did you?" Malachi's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the very air in the room had thickened, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The flames in the hearth flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more insistent, until Malachi felt as though he might drown in their voices. "You're trapped, Malachi," the man said, his voice smooth and chilling. "You always were. The fire knows you. It knows everything about you." Malachi's mind raced. He had tried to bury his past, to run from it, but now it was standing in front of him, manifesting in the form of this stranger. The flames, the whispers, the shadows, they were all a reflection of him, of the man he had become. And there was nowhere left to hide. "What do you want from me?" Malachi finally managed to rasp, his voice hoarse with fear. The man smiled, a slow, cruel smile. "What I want, Malachi, is for you to understand the truth. You thought you could use the dead. You thought you could trap their souls in your candles, control them, make them serve you. But that's not how this works. You never controlled them. They controlled you." Malachi's heart slammed against his chest. He had suspected it, deep down. The candles, the fire, the spirits, they were never under his control. He had been feeding them, giving them power, letting them grow stronger with each soul he took. But now the truth was clear. The dead had been manipulating him all along. The stranger's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "You're the one who opened the door, Malachi. You're the one who gave them power. You invited them into your life, into your soul, and now they're here to collect." The fire in the hearth flared, the flames growing hotter, their light casting long, shifting shadows across the saloon. Malachi could feel the heat against his skin, burning into him, scorching him from the inside out. The whispers in the room were deafening now, swirling around him like a hurricane of voices. He could hear their demands, their cries for vengeance. The dead were not done with him. "What do you mean they're here to collect?" Malachi asked, his voice shaking, his knees weak. The man stepped closer, his face inches from Malachi's. "The price, Malachi, the price you've been avoiding. You took their lives, and now they want theirs. Back. And you, You're going to be the one to pay." Suddenly, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. The flames in the hearth roared louder, and Malachi felt a cold, sinking feeling in his gut. He tried to move, to run, but his legs were frozen, as if they were bound by invisible chains. The dead were closing in on him, their whispers growing louder, their presence suffocating. The stranger's voice was low and dark, almost hypnotic. "The fire, Malachi. It isn't just a source of light, it's a prison for the souls you've taken. And now you're trapped inside it." Malachi's eyes darted to the flames. The fire was no longer just a flickering light, it had become something else, something malevolent. The flames twisted and churned, shifting like they were alive, like they were reaching for him. He could feel their pull, their insatiable hunger, their need for him. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The stranger chuckled darkly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Yes, the fire feeds on your sins, Malachi, and it will never stop burning. It will never let you go. The dead have been waiting for this, and now they're coming to collect." Suddenly, the candles in the saloon flared, their flames stretching higher, growing hotter, brighter. The walls seemed to shift, the air thick with heat, as if the very saloon was burning with the souls of the dead. Malachi's heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning with the realization that the curse he had thought he could control was far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. The stranger stepped back, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "It's too late now. The fire will consume you, just like it consumed them, and the dead will have their revenge." Malachi tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat. The flames roared louder, the heat searing his skin. He could feel himself being pulled toward them, drawn into the fire, into the darkness. The spirits were coming for him, and there was no escape. The fire wasn't just consuming the saloon, it was consuming him. And as the flames grew higher, Malachi realized that the price of redemption was far worse than he had ever imagined. The fire raged, its flames stretching and twisting, casting grotesque shadows across the saloon. The air was thick with heat, suffocating, as though the very walls of the tavern were closing in on him. Malachi could feel the weight of the flames pressing against him, pushing him deeper into the fire. Every breath burned in his chest, his lungs filling with the acrid smoke that seemed to choke the very life out of him. The spirits his victims were, all around him, their whispers rising in a crescendo, louder and louder until they were all he could hear. They were angry, they were hungry, and they weren't just haunting him anymore. They were taking control. Malachi staggered back, his mind spinning. The stranger that man had been right. The dead weren't just trapped in the flames. They were alive, living through him, feeding on his guilt and his fear. The more he tried to destroy the candles, the more they grew, their flames devouring everything in their path, growing stronger with each passing moment. The fire had become more than a force of nature. It had become a presence, a living, breathing thing, and it was angry. The flames in the hearth roared, as if responding to his thoughts. The fire wanted him. It needed him. Malachi couldn't think. His chest was tight, his heart racing. The saloon was no longer a refuge. It had become a prison, a hell of his own making. The walls seemed to close in on him, the fire pushing him to the edge of madness. There was no escape, no way out. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, becoming more distinct. Malachi froze, his blood running cold. He turned toward the flames, his eyes wide with terror. Through the shifting fire, a figure appeared, a woman. Her face burned and twisted, her eyes empty voids of rage. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for him, her voice echoing in his mind. "You thought you could escape us." Malachi backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to tilt, as if the very air was warping around him. The fire was no longer just in the hearth. It was everywhere, consuming the air, the walls, the very floor beneath his feet. "You will pay for what you've done." Her voice was like ice, cutting through him, tearing at the edges of his sanity. The flames crackled, their heat unbearable, and Malachi fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he clutched his chest. He could feel the weight of the spirits, their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. They were everywhere, their faces flashing in the fire, their voices ringing in his ears. "We are your sin, Malachi." And then, just as quickly as it had come, the fire stilled. The room fell silent. The heat, the pressure, it all disappeared in an instant. The flames returned to their normal, flickering state, the whispers fading into nothingness. Malachi stood there, breathing heavily, sweat dripping from his forehead. His mind was reeling. What had just happened? What was real? And what was just another part of the nightmare he had created? He looked around the saloon. The shadows were still there, but the fire had returned to its normal state. It flickered in the hearth, casting the usual comforting light, nothing more. But deep down, Malachi knew it wasn't over. The dead were still watching him. The flames still burned with their hunger. Malachi could feel the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. He couldn't run. He couldn't escape what he had done. The souls of the dead had found him, and they wouldn't let him go. He staggered toward the bar, his hands trembling as he grabbed the nearest candle. His eyes flicked from the flame to the dark corners of the room. The dead were still out there, watching, waiting. But something was different now. He wasn't the man who had first walked into this saloon, hoping to outrun his past. He wasn't the man who thought he could control the fire. The saloon wasn't just his prison. It was his reckoning, and it was finally time to pay the price. Malachi's fingers tightened around the candle, and with a flick of his wrist, he threw it into the fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flames leaped higher, twisting violently in the hearth. The room shook with an unnatural force, as though the saloon itself was being torn apart. The candles all flared, their flames erupting in a blinding blaze. Malachi stepped back, watching in horror as the fire seemed to consume everything in its path. The walls cracked, the floorboards groaned, and the air became thick with smoke and ash. The spirits were rising, the dead were breaking free. But in that moment, Malachi realized something. The fire didn't control him anymore. He had been feeding it, yes. He had been feeding his sins, his guilt, his past. But now the fire was his past. The dead were no longer his masters. In the center of the chaos, as the flames reached higher and higher, Malachi did the one thing he had been too afraid to do before. He let go. He embraced the fire. The flames roared louder, engulfing the saloon. And for the first time, Malachi didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel controlled. The fire had no hold on him anymore. The dead couldn't claim him. He had taken the power from them. And as the saloon burned, Malachi stood tall, finally free of the curse he had created. But in the ashes of his past, something remained. The fire might have been defeated, but the dead would always return, and Malachi would never escape their reach. The saloon was a shell of its former self. The fire had consumed nearly everything: furniture, walls, the very essence of the place. Ash filled the air, the remnants of a life that Malachi had tried so hard to leave behind. The flames had burned, yes, but not in the way he had imagined. They had torn through the past, and now all that was left was a smoldering ruin. But something wasn't right. Malachi stood in the center of the wreckage, his body cold despite the heat that still flickered in the scorched remains of the fire. The voices, the spirits, had gone quiet. The whispers that had been his constant torment were no longer in his mind. There was silence, complete, suffocating silence. For a moment, he thought it was over. He had destroyed the candles, the fire, and with it, the curse. He had broken free from the dead, but then he felt it, a shift in the air. The temperature dropped, the room darkened, and with it, a strange pressure settled over him. He turned slowly, his breath catching as his eyes fell upon the one thing he hadn't destroyed: the last candle. It was sitting on the bar, untouched by the flames, the wick still flickering in a faint, unnatural glow. The flame was different this time. It wasn't the warm, comforting light he had come to expect. It was cold, blue, and burning with a sharp, painful intensity. Malachi's heart pounded as he stepped toward it, drawn by something beyond his control. His hand reached out, trembling, and for a brief second he hesitated. But then the fire seemed to call to him, pulling at his soul like a magnetic force. The flame flickered, casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers grazed the edge of the candle, and in that instant the flames surged, its light blinding him. He pulled back, stumbling as the room seemed to shift. The walls distorted, twisting as if alive, and the floor beneath him seemed to crack open, revealing a dark abyss. A cold laugh echoed around him, hollow and mocking. "Did you think you could destroy us so easily?" a voice hissed, and Malachi spun around, panic flooding his chest. It was the figure, the man from his past. But this time, he wasn't just a man. His form flickered, half-formed, his face twisted and disfigured by the flames. He was no longer human. He was part of the fire, part of the curse that had been feeding on Malachi's guilt. "No," Malachi gasped, his voice trembling. I thought it was over." The figure took a step forward, the flames around him intensifying. "You cannot destroy what has already been given life. You were always meant to feed the fire. You can never escape the curse, Malachi. You were chosen. We were chosen." Malachi's breath caught in his throat. The figure's words didn't make sense, but they resonated in a way that made his skin crawl. He had thought he was fighting against something he could control, something that could be destroyed. But it was more than that. The dead, the fire, the saloon, it was all connected. He hadn't just been feeding the flames, he'd been becoming part of them. The figure's distorted smile widened, and his voice grew louder, more insistent. "You've taken our lives, and in return, we take yours. You are our keeper, our flame." Malachi's hands clenched into fists as the room seemed to close in on him. The dead weren't just haunting him, they had been using him. His every action had been feeding their power, drawing them closer. He had thought the fire was his way out, his means of escaping the burden of his past, but it was never that simple. With a sudden, violent motion, the figure lunged toward Malachi, its form becoming a mass of writhing shadows and fire. The flames grew hotter, colder, twisting in unnatural patterns, as though the very essence of the saloon was being torn apart. Malachi stumbled back, his heart racing. He couldn't outrun it, he couldn't fight it. And then, in the distance, he saw someone, a shape moving through the smoke, the woman's face, the one who had first appeared in the fire. But this time, she was different. She wasn't twisted with rage. Her eyes weren't burning with anger. She was calm, almost peaceful. Her voice whispered through the chaos, soft and pleading. "It's not too late." Malachi's breath hitched, the words like a lifeline in the sea of darkness surrounding him. What do you want from me?" Her form flickered, like a reflection in a broken mirror. "You can still end it. You can still stop it, but you must let go. Let go." The words echoed in his mind, a strange sense of clarity beginning to settle over him. The fire had always been his way of holding on. He had thought it was a means of survival, a way to control the darkness inside him. But it wasn't. The fire wasn't his to control. It had always been the dead's, and he had been the one feeding it. The figure, still lingering, snarled in fury. "You cannot break free. You are ours." Malachi's heart hammered in his chest, but for the first time he felt something different. Control. In a sudden, desperate motion, he grabbed the last candle, and without thinking, slammed it into the hearth. The flames roared to life, more intense than ever before. The figure screamed, but it was drowned out by the roar of the fire, the crackling flames enveloping everything in its path. The saloon began to crumble, the walls shaking as if the entire building was fighting against its inevitable end. Malachi stood there, watching the fire burn brighter, feeling the heat wash over him. He had been given a choice though, feed the fire or let it consume him, and in that moment, he chose to let it burn. But even as the flames engulfed everything, Malachi realized that his choice had only sealed his fate. The fire may have burned the saloon, but it had not burned away the dead. They would always return. The fire had consumed everything. The saloon, once a refuge, was nothing more than a smoldering ruin. The air was thick with smoke, the crackling of burning wood echoing in the silence. Malachi stood amid the wreckage, his body numb, his mind fractured by the chaos around him. The flames, though dimming, still burned in his chest, their heat searing through him like a brand. But even as the fire roared around him, something deeper, darker, began to stir in the ashes. The whispers of the dead had gone silent, but their presence lingered. They were here, waiting. Malachi could feel them pulling at the edges of his consciousness. He had thought that by embracing the fire, by feeding it, he had destroyed them. But in the back of his mind, he knew better. The dead couldn't be destroyed. They couldn't be burned away. They were always there, inside him. "You can't run from us," a voice whispered in the shadows, sharp and mocking. It was familiar, the voice of the man who had first come to him, the one who had shown him the price of his sins. Malachi turned sharply, his eyes scanning the darkened room, but there was no one there, only the burning remnants of the saloon, the light flickering in unnatural patterns. He stumbled toward the bar, his legs weak, his hands shaking. The fire had taken everything, but there was one thing he couldn't escape: his guilt, his sins. The dead were part of him now, a curse that would never leave. "I never wanted this," Malachi muttered, his voice low and broken. "I never wanted any of this." "You don't get to decide that," the voice hissed again, this time closer. The flames flared in response, the heat growing unbearable. The shadows in the room seemed to reach toward him, their forms twisting and writhing like a storm. "You can't undo what you've done." Malachi turned toward the hearth, the last remnants of the fire roaring with a new, violent intensity. The flames now seemed to grow into something more than just fire. A presence, something alive, something hungry. The dead were gathering, their shapes flickering in the fire, their faces twisted in rage. But there was something else. In the midst of the chaos, Malachi saw it. A shadow in the flames, a figure stepping forward. The woman, her. Her face was still disfigured, her eyes hollow, but there was something in her gaze now, a faint glimmer of recognition, of understanding. Malachi felt a strange, sudden calm wash over him as their eyes locked. You're here," he whispered. The woman nodded, her lips parting to speak, but no sound came. Her figure wavered like a reflection in broken glass. Still, Malachi could feel her presence as stronger than any of the others. And for the first time, he felt as though she wasn't just a victim of his past. She was something else. She was a part of him. "Let go," she finally whispered, the words clear and ringing in his mind. Her voice wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, deep and resonant, echoing through him like a truth he had always known. Malachi's breath caught in his throat. He had been running from the fire, from his sins, from the dead, but now he realized something that terrified him. The fire wasn't just punishment, it was catharsis. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, but the fire, the souls, the dead, they had never been the enemy. He was the enemy. It was his guilt, his fear, his refusal to face the truth that had fueled the flames all along. The dead weren't his curse, they were his reckoning. "Let go," the woman's voice whispered again, this time with more urgency. Malachi felt the weight of his own soul, the burden of his sins, pressing down on him. The fire was still burning, but now it didn't feel like something trying to consume him. It was something he had to face. It was his judgment, his redemption. The figure in the flamish was waiting. The dead were waiting, but so was he. The flames flared brighter once more, the heat searing his skin. The room spun, the walls closing in. His chest tightened as the whispers returned, louder than ever, the voices of the dead demanding their reckoning. But now Malachi knew what he had to do. He had to let go. In one swift motion, he stepped into the fire. The heat hit him like a wave, burning through his clothes, his skin, his soul. But instead of pain, there was only a rushous sense of release, as though the flames were purging him. He felt his guilt, his fear, his anger, all of it melting away, consumed by the very thing he had been running from. The fire wasn't his end. It was redemption. For the first time in years, he could breathe. And as the fire burned around him, Malachi knew that the dead had taken their revenge, but they had given him something too: freedom. The flames roared louder, as if acknowledging his surrender. And in the midst of the inferno, the woman's face appeared again, calm, peaceful. She smiled at him, her eyes finally at rest. The fire began to die down, the smoke swirling around him, and when it cleared, Malachi was no longer standing in the saloon. The ashes, the flamesta were gone. The room was empty, and so was he. But even as the last of the fire flickered out, Malachi realized that his journey hadn't ended. The dead may have claimed their vengeance, but the fire had also given him a new life. And that life, that freedom, would come with its own price. The saloon was gone. The fire had consumed it, every scrap of wood, every flicker of light. What remained was nothing but ash, and the smoldering remains of what had once been Malachi's refuge. The flames had burned away his past, his sins, and yet, in the aftermath, he felt empty, hollow. The fire had freed him, yes, but the dead were still out there waiting, and he was left standing in the ashes with nothing but the silence of a place that had once been full of life and laughter. Malachi took a step forward, his foot crunching on the blackened earth, the remnants of the saloon's floor. The smoke still hung in the air, thick and acrid. His chest ached, but it wasn't from the fire's burn. It was the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had done. In the distance, a figure appeared. The wind carried the scent of the desert, dry and sharp, and the figure slowly came into view. It was the woman. She stood at the edge of the ruins, her figure outlined against the pale light of the desert horizon. For a moment, Malachi thought she was just another phantom, a figment of his fading sanity. But then she spoke, her voice soft, almost as if it were carried by the wind itself. "You've done it," she said, her eyes calm, free of the rage that had once burned in them. "You freed them." Malachi's heart pounded in his chest. He knew who she was now. She was the first soul he had taken, the first soul he had condemned to the flames. And now, she was no longer a prisoner of the fire. She was at peace. But at what cost? Malachi asked, his voice barely a whisper. His throat was dry, his words hollow. "I've lost everything." "You haven't lost everything," she replied. "You've gained something far greater." Malachi stared at her, confusion settling over him like a fog. "What could I possibly have gained from this?" he asked bitterly. "The fire has taken everything. I've lost the saloon. I've lost my past. I've lost myself." The woman smiled gently. "You haven't lost yourself. You found yourself. The fire didn't just burn away the saloon. It burned away your guilt, your fear. It burned away the part of you that kept running." Malachi's mind raced. The fire had consumed him, yes. It had consumed everything: his sins, his guilt, the spirits. But was she right? Had it truly set him free, or had it just burned him alive, leaving only ashes behind? "The dead are free now," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "But they aren't the only ones who need freedom. You needed to be set free from yourself." Malachi swallowed hard. "And now what?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What do I do now? Where do I go?" The woman's gaze softened. "You've paid the price. The fire has cleansed you, but the world hasn't forgotten. There will always be consequences. There will always be darkness." Malachi clenched his fists, anger flaring. "I've already faced the consequences. I've burned everything. I've burned the saloon, the dead, and myself. What more is there?" She stepped closer, her figure still glowing faintly in the light. "You think the fire was an end, but it was just a beginning. The world outside these ashes isn't the same as it was. You're not the same man who walked in that saloon. You're something else now." Malachi didn't speak. He couldn't find the words. The idea of stepping into the world again, after everything that had happened, was terrifying. He had burned his past, but what kind of future was there for him now? "You're not alone," the woman continued, her voice gentle. "You've freed the souls of the dead, but there are still those who are lost. There are those who need you. You can choose to walk away, to leave it all behind, but you can also help those who are still trapped, just like you were." Malachi's eyes widened as realization washed over him. He hadn't just faced his past by burning the saloon, he had faced a greater responsibility. He had been the keeper of the dead, yes, but now he had the chance to do something different, something good. "But I can't go back to who I was," he murmured, unsure. "How do I know I won't just fall again?" The woman smiled softly, almost sadly. "No one is perfect, Malachi, but you're stronger now. You've faced the fire. You've chosen to stand in the ashes. The choice is yours." Malachi stood there in silence, the wind howling around him, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had been running for so long, hiding from his past, from his guilt. But now the fire had shown him the truth. He couldn't run anymore. He had to face the consequences. He had to live with them. And if that meant helping the lost souls, then so be it. "I won't run anymore," he said softly, his voice steady, a new determination rising in his chest. "I'll face it. I'll make it right." The woman's smile grew brighter, as if she had been waiting for him to say those words. She nodded once before her form began to fade, slowly dissolving into the desert winds. "Then it's time for you to go. The world still needs a keeper." Malachi watched her disappear, her figure vanishing into the distance. The fire had burned, the dead had been freed, and now it was his turn to walk away into a future he could shape. But as the last of the smoke cleared, he realized one thing. The fire may have burned everything he had known, but it had also forged something new. And for the first time, he could see the world with clear eyes. Malachi walked into the night, the ruins of the saloon behind him. The fire had burned, but it had not consumed him. It had set him free. And now, he would carry the light of the dead into the world, a world that was ready for redemption. The journey had only just begun. Final payoff. As Malachi walked away from the smoldering ruins of the saloon, the weight of everything he had lost hung heavy on his shoulders. The fire had burned away his past, his sins, his guilt, but in its wake, it had left something new, something he had never expected: freedom. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that tavern all those years ago. He had faced the fire, the dead, and the consequences of his choices. And now, for the first time, he was ready to face the world again, not as a keeper of the dead, but as someone who could help those still lost in the flames. The dead may have been freed, but Malachi knew his journey wasn't over. The world was waiting for him, and though he walked into the unknown, for the first time in his life, he wasn't running. The fire had burned, but now, it was his light to carry.